please join me in welcoming Susan Eisenhower and H.W. Brands.
Hello, Susan.
How are you, Bill? Good to see you.
Very good. And hello to all the friends of Rancho Mirage Writers Festival that are out there. Susan, I'm delighted. I was, first of all, delighted to get a copy of your book. We had spoken about it when you were in the final stages of writing it. And it meets certainly all of my expectations and hopes. It's a wonderful book. And it really affords insight, not simply into Dwight Eisenhower and his leadership abilities and his performance and his decision-making process, but also into the nature of leadership generally. So in that regard, I consider it sort of a model of what I try to get my students to do, to take a moment in history and to understand that moment in history, but to extrapolate that. What lessons can we take from that moment in history? So anybody who's interested in leadership, certainly in an American context, but considering Ike's role in World War II, in a world context, can benefit immensely from reading this book. So my first question to you is, what took you so long to write the book?
Oh, that's a fun question.
And why now?
Well, it's a funny question. First of all, let me just say how great it is to be back at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, albeit virtually, right? And thanks to Jamie Cavler and the entire team, all the angels. So that's an excellent question. I have to say that I have been inspired by going to the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. This is my 5th book, but there was an embarrassingly lengthy period of time between books, and I've gotten an enormous amount of support from people like you and been so impressed by the scholarship that's been done on so many issues that, well, I thought maybe I should do what I thought was going to be a retirement book and do it now. And, you know, first of all, why wait? But also, I think Ike still has something to say to us. And I don't know if you got any sense of that, Bill, in the course of your reading, but there's some eerie echoes when he describes, for instance, the dangers to our society when only the voices of the left and the voices of the right are heard, or the extremists are heard in the public space. And I just thought that now is the time to do it.
So tell me, what advantages and what potential disadvantages did you face sharing a last name with your subject?
Ah, wow. Well, you know, the thing is that I was already born when he became president, so I've sort of grown up with it my whole life. And I must say that my parents were very wise about their professional choices and later their decision to take us up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, because people didn't pay too much attention to the fact that we were being followed by a Secret Service contingent. So, but I must say, as I entered my professional life, this shadow is very long. I mean, this bright shadow, if there is an ironic way of putting it. Short of becoming a psychologist or a medical doctor, I don't think there's anything that he did that didn't touch us in some way. But having said that, Bill, I have to point out that I was raised to be fully compartmentalized, to mentally and emotionally keep my relationship with Granddad, as we call him, separate from his public record. Now, this is the first time I've ever tried to put them together in a way. And I thought, since the Eisenhower Memorial was being dedicated and other good reasons to write this book, that there were some insights that I might be able to offer just from what was discussed around the dining room table and the way he approached things that went on in our family. And I hope that it's added something to the record.
Your book suggests that alumni of the Eisenhower administration were happy to talk to you about the boss, as they call it.
They were so good to me. Honestly, when I moved to Washington, I only knew 2 people in town, believe it or not. And this group just swept in and took me under their wings. And it was wonderful, actually. I was in my late 20s and they were in their late 70s, if not mid to late 80s. And I traveled with some of them and got to know them all personally. They were always making references to the boss. And the thing that was rather wonderful about it is you knew that you were getting some of this firsthand. General Goodpaster, for instance, who really took me under his wing, he was Ike's day-to-day national security person. He had a different title than that, but that's really what his function was. And he used to quote Ike all the time, like, let's not make our mistakes in a hurry, or all generalizations are false, including this one. And it was a lot of, A, it was fun, but B, they felt like they had to convey things to me.
So I have to share with you a feeling that I've had about trying to study the Eisenhower administration. And in one respect, the administration and its personnel are very disappointing to the historian. And that sense is this, that they either liked each other too much, or they were too loyal to their boss to leave the administration and immediately write poison pen memoirs. And those kind of memoirs are great for the voyeur like me, the professional voyeur coming in and trying to tell the story. How do you account for that?
Well, I don't think that this was the usual run-of-the-mill type cabinet and organization. That's just the way it was. First of all, I think that the tell-all books now are much more common today than they were back then anyway. But these were mostly people who were coming to give back and to involve themselves in public service for a period of time and then go back to what they were doing. And they just didn't feel the need. Now, there are plenty of memoirs on this subject. Herbert Brownell wrote a terrific book about advising Ike. Arthur Larson, we have Arthur Larson to thank for letting us know what it was like to write a speech for Dwight Eisenhower. I don't think it was a lot of fun, by the way, because Ike had been a speechwriter for Douglas MacArthur, as you know, and was, I think, to quote Arthur Larson, death on superlatives. And if you tried to make any assertion without having the facts behind it, he'd get out a big red pen and put it right through. So we have all those wonderful anecdotes that come from them. And then Bill Ewald wrote a terrific book called Ike the President. And I say terrific just because it's so colorful. But none of them are really the poison pen types you might say. And I even looked through Emmett Hughes's book, which was supposed to be, you know, like a slam on the president, and it's pretty tame stuff.
Yeah. So
I think so much about society was different then.
Well, let me see if I can draw a little bit out from you.
Okay.
You mentioned Douglas MacArthur, and I think that Ike one time said that he studied drama under Douglas MacArthur. Tell us a little bit about this relationship between the two men who would be essentially the two great heroes of World War II for the United States, because they had a long history before World War II, and they had a history after World War II as well.
Well, Bill, you know, because I did this at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, but I had the great opportunity to interview you about your wonderful book, The General versus the President. And so somebody needs to write a book about General Eisenhower and General MacArthur. What a pair. It's a classic story of a protege finally outstripping the glory from his former mentor. And the reason I say that, Douglas MacArthur wanted to be president of the United States. And according to one of Ike's old associates who was still alive when they were being so kind to me, he told me that during the Chicago convention, he walked down a hallway and Douglas MacArthur was in the next room practicing his acceptance speech. So they have this long history that starts fairly early in Ike's career, and it goes through high points and low points. As you know, some of the low points, of course, was when, well, certainly the bonus march after World War I in Washington, and then he goes out with MacArthur to the Philippines, and I think that's when things became really very strained between the two of them. I don't know how much detail you want to go into here, but they were very different personalities, and I suspected at some points that Eisenhower wanted to make sure that he was the un-MacArthur. Not the imperious guy, but the person who probably invented the management idea of leading by walking around. You know, I think he probably branded that idea as we saw during the war. So I don't know. I think the two of them are a riot. Even though Ike, as you know, on the Korean matter, did consult with MacArthur after Eisenhower went to Korea to decide you know, what his new administration was going to do about that war. But I think there's plenty of fireworks there. So I would encourage you to do it.
Well, I think, I mean, as in my interpretation of it, one thing that Eisenhower learned from MacArthur was how not to be that political general. Can you talk about that and how it actually wound up working in Ike's political favor when he finally reluctantly decided to throw his hat into the ring?
Well, that's right. I mean, one of my favorite photographs of all times, and it's too bad we don't have it to put up here, is Eisenhower's face when he gets the news that MacArthur's been fired. You know, members of the family often joke about what mobile faces he had, and I'm afraid some of us inherited that. And it's just a classic look. I'm not going to do an imitation. I invite you to if you want to. In any case, you know, MacArthur was, it seemed to me, and you're the expert on MacArthur, but it seemed to me that he was always pushing the envelope. He had strong ideas about things. He wasn't very good at following orders or managing, you know, other big personalities. I did say in the 1930s, however, that MacArthur was a genius at giving clear instruction. So he obviously admired some things about it, but according to Eisenhower's memoirs, MacArthur even used the royal we instead of referring to himself as I. So these were temperamentally different people, as we said, but MacArthur was always dipping in and out of the political world and making statements that were really, in Eisenhower's view, inappropriate for a military officer. And then in the Philippines, they have a big dust up over MacArthur's desire to accept a rank in the Philippine Army and to take some kind of big bonus for it. So in Eisenhower's view, MacArthur was always sort of dipping into things he shouldn't be into. I think also, if I could add one more thing to this, I think temperamentally, Dwight Eisenhower would be a good example of a successful middle child, that he was used to really a very raucous alpha male kind of environment. He was one of 7 boys, 6 surviving boys. And being in the middle, he could often, you know, navigate between his older brother and his younger brothers, all of whom had completely different political ideas, by the way. So he was sort of non-political, I'd say, in his heart.
Okay. The title of your book is How Ike Led. And I want to ask you to elaborate on that, but I'll begin by saying that you talk about Eisenhower's understanding of the difference between strategic leadership and operational leadership. Can you describe that in the context of World War II and the European theater, and then in the context of the presidency in the White House?
Well, that's a great question. Strategic leadership is the top guy who's got to rationalize a million different factors. That, you know, during World War II, Eisenhower was responsible for, first of all, bringing about what he called unity of purpose. And he had to do this among a fractured, very, very opinionated and exciting but difficult personalities. They didn't agree. The British and the Americans didn't agree about a lot, and it was Ike's responsibility to, you know, make something of that, right? So he's got that political thing going on. Then he's got all of the politics below him at a different level. He's got the strategy for the war. Then he has to worry about logistics, timelines, resources. As you know, there were huge fights about landing craft and all kinds of other military equipment that would make all the difference between perhaps success and failure. So that's the strategic leader's job, is to make something coherent out of all those factors. An operational leader is a person who's responsible for one sector of that. It might be a big section, but it's not the overall considerations. So I just think in reading all the great scholarship, and by the way, my book is not an attempt to supplant any of the great work that's been done by scholars. It's to try and get people interested in the subject so that they'll read the great books out there that are of greater length, etc. But in reading all this, I noticed that they were always, that there's a lot of scholarship that quotes his subordinates. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, they're operational leaders. They may have a big piece of the pie, but they're still operational leaders, and they didn't have the same job description or considerations that Eisenhower had. So it'd be like saying that the CEO is being sniped about from his director of marketing or his, human resources executive. Or so it seemed to me that the more important calculation was what did Ike's bosses think of his performance? And I think it'd be fair to say that he did not in any serious way lose the confidence of the people who had put him in that position. One other factor which is really important is I don't think Eisenhower would have been as good of a strategic leader if he hadn't gone through those operational realms, because it really helped. He worked in logistics, during, first of all, during the first war and then later between the wars. So all of that adds up to a capacity to think these things through at the highest level.
When Eisenhower got elected president, Harry Truman is said to have said, "Poor Ike. He's going to discover that this is so different from the Army. There you give an order and somebody follows the order. Here you give an order and nobody pays any attention." Can you describe the difference as Eisenhower experienced it between the military realm and the political realm, and how well you think he managed the transition?
Well, that's a great subject, and I think there's an example of where he makes a very big mistake while he's making that transition. Let me just say on the strategic leadership thing to your earlier question, because it feeds right into this, is that the President of the United States is the nation's strategic leader. And I think in that respect, Eisenhower was very well suited for being president. On the other hand, as you say, the culture was dramatically different. So the Army, or I should say the military, is very vertical, and you give an order and people follow your order or they're gone. Then he went from there into academia. Now this always makes me smile because, as we know, Bill, right, this is the most horizontal of all cultures, and it really requires something extraordinary to herd these wonderfully brilliant cats. Then you get to retail politics, which is back to Harry Truman's comment. And I don't know, I'd say it's like it's a sliding scale between vertical and horizontal, and frankly, fairly chaotic in between. I think it was a big adjustment for Ike, even though, of course, there had been politics he had to deal with as both Supreme Commander and later as Chief of Staff. Now, if you'll indulge me for one more minute, I'd like to say that he had a real comeuppance early on in the 1952 campaign, when it was suggested that in Wisconsin, Eisenhower was somehow disrespecting George Marshall when he took a piece of the paragraph about George Marshall out of his speech because Senator MacArthur was there. I think it was a classic example of that extraordinary moment when he realizes that he actually got sandbagged by his staff, which in Ike world is about the worst thing that he could possibly imagine, and was completely unused to that. He had already made any number of speeches defending George Marshall, and he thought he was on the record. Well, welcome to retail politics. I will say about that, though, to conclude this thought, is that he made mistakes once, but he didn't tend to ever make the same mistake a second time.
The common criticism in the media of Eisenhower while he was president, especially in his second term, is that Ike, he's such a bland fellow. And there's no personality there. Now, people who worked with Eisenhower knew that there was plenty of personality, but I want to ask you about, in Eisenhower's leadership approach, how important was personality? How important was his process for making decisions?
Well, first of all, I think Eisenhower would be the first to recognize the complexity of our Constitution. It's worth noting that he took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States when he was 22 years old at West Point, and spent his entire life serving something bigger than himself. That's the United States. He took it again when he, both times in his presidency, and he was a real student of history. So he understood that the Constitution of the United States gives the president almost an impossible set of roles. First, to be head of state. I'm not even putting these numerically. To be head of state, to be chief executive, and to be the head of your political party. And if Eisenhower came across as bland, it's because he thought perhaps emphasizing the head of state from an optics point of view would be an easier way to get people to cooperate and would shore up American standing in the world during the Cold War. So yeah, being head of state looks pretty bland, and I'm sure that there are plenty of monarchs in the world who are similarly accused by their subjects. But behind the scenes, Eisenhower was highly dynamic, actually as funny as he could be, because he had little foibles and quirks and things, and everybody got a kick out of those. A very, very strong personality who had to confide most of his frustration to what he thought were secret diaries. Ha ha. I mean, those didn't last too long, but so I think that's really it. He saw it as part of his role to be, in a way, unexciting because he thought that he would get people to cooperate in a more effective way than being in the headlines every day. Why don't I just leave it there?
Well, I seem to recall a moment when he was about to go out for a press conference, and he was going to have to talk about some really delicate issue. And I believe Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, was trying to brief him and was really concerned that he would say something wrong. And Eisenhower said, "Don't worry, I'll just go out there and confuse them."
Right.
So how much of, and then you get on the subject of Eisenhower's dealings, you mentioned, with Joseph McCarthy. And this seems to be a model of how to undermine, I think you put it as the demagogue, without getting your hands dirty. So can you tell us a little bit about how Ike in action was this deeper, more subtle leader than most people realized at the time?
That's a great question. And the McCarthy thing has, there are a couple of, I don't know, interesting things about this, especially in the context of our times. But Eisenhower really did operate on a set of principles that were honed probably before the war, but given exclamation points during the war. And that is, he didn't believe in so-called personalities. He didn't believe in personalizing things that were larger than an individual. And he saw McCarthy as a perfect example of the kind of demagogue that this country couldn't tolerate. But he refused to use Senator McCarthy's name because he knew that McCarthy wanted to be elevated to the level of presidency and to engage in a kind of tit for tat. Every time you use Senator McCarthy's name, he asked for equal time, and before you know it, you've actually given the guy a platform he didn't have before. Now, during that period, this is in the first term, there's something else that's important to know about Eisenhower. He was a strategist, and not only did he want to deprive his adversary of what his adversary wanted, which was publicity, but he was very adept at knowing what he controlled and what he didn't. And I think this is the part that is often missing in the story that the general public gets, is that as a co-equal branch of government, the head of a co-equal branch of government, the President of the United States does not control the behavior of United States senators. And Ike was in a bind because the Senate at that time had his own political party in control, and they supported Senator McCarthy. So his job was to figure out how he could reduce or eliminate Senator McCarthy's influence without wrecking his own party, and getting them to do the right thing, even though they were supporting the Wisconsin senator. So it was a very, it was a perfect example of where working behind the scenes was more effective, in his view, than standing up at the bully pulpit criticizing somebody personally. He didn't mind standing up and talking about general American principles about discourse and other things, but and it drove people nuts. It drove his critics nuts, it drove some people in his administration nuts, and it drove at least a few family members nuts. But he was very firm on this. And this was just something he figured out during the war. You know, you go insult somebody publicly and you got them on your case for the duration.
Your book
I thought it had a certain contemporary flair to it, that story.
I think it does. So your book is full of examples of decisions that Eisenhower had to make. And I want to ask you about a few of them, a particular point in them. So you describe that when Ike was making the decision to go ahead on D-Day, June 1944, and he's got this window where the weather looks like it's going to be acceptable. And he gives the go-ahead. But meanwhile, he writes the message that is going to be delivered in case the operation fails. Can you say a little bit about that and what it tells us about Ike as the leader?
Well, you know, that note has become rather famous. He says, if any fault attaches to this, if any blame attaches to this, the blame is mine and mine alone. He felt if he was asking to be managing, you know, this operation, especially where for the first time in military history, the Supreme Allied Commander had control over all the forces, that he couldn't possibly blame anybody else for a decision. But I think this goes even farther back. I think he understood from West Point and onwards that leadership is about trust. It's, as a matter of fact, I think trust is central to leadership. And you're never going to gain any group of people's trust if you're always blaming them when you were the person who made the decision. He carried that note, he later said, as much for himself as for anyone else should it be released. And apparently, I was surprised to discover this, carried one of those notes for every major operation of the war.
You do a very nice job teasing out Eisenhower's words of, well, words of encouragement, words of confidence to the troops that are about to take off for Normandy. Can you, and you talk about what you think he was trying to convey, what he was trying to get across. Can you take us back to that moment briefly? I don't want to spoil your story for the folks out there who haven't read it yet, but it's a wonderful illustration of Eisenhower's understanding of how the guy at the top has to connect with the guy at the bottom.
Oh, I think that is so true. And I think another way of thinking about it is the guy at the top, he had a lot of courage to go out and look at the people who were going to be directly affected by that decision. Now, what's so significant about going to see the airborne troops that night, it's the night of June 5th. They're going to take off for the Normandy coast to uncertain fates, but it was worse than that because his own technical advisor, Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, predicted that the losses of those airborne troops would be between 50 and 70% because the Germans had just moved some divisions into the area. And if you can imagine that, that's catastrophic. It's actually sending people to a slaughter. They wouldn't be able to accomplish their mission with so few if that number was going to be correct. Now, Trafford Leigh-Mallory presents this information about a week before D-Day. And so Ike goes to his cabin and thinks through all of the, strips down the problem, as he would have said, and decided that he had to take the risk because his own feeling is that this prediction was a bit high. Now, I don't know what would happen in a contemporary situation like this, but I do know that it takes a lot of moral courage to go out then to see the airborne troops. And when he was looking in those boys' eyes, he had to have Leigh-Mallory's assessment in the back of his head. That 50 to 70% of those boys were getting on an airplane and would be gone by morning or later. But the point is that he was sending them to their deaths. And I think that's extraordinary. It turns out that they were the linchpin of the operation, so they played a key role in the outcome of D-Day. But of course, the casualties and the deaths were nothing like that. It was way lower, you know, and they did an amazing job. But nobody knew that at the time. So he goes out to the airfield, and he's looking these boys straight in the eye. Now, the most famous picture of this is Ike looking like he's giving the pep talk of a lifetime. And we know from that tall paratrooper that he was actually talking about fly fishing. So the idea is that, I mean, that was just Ike anyway. He was out, when he would meet the paratroopers from Kansas, he'd talk about football scores with Wally Strobel, who was the tall paratrooper, and they were talking about fly fishing. This was all natural because he'd say, what do you do when you're home? He was looking at these boys, and you know, the other thing, Bill, is that my grandparents, Ike and Mamie, lost a son when he was 3 years old. And Ike said he never got over it. I mean, he was hollowed out in some ways by this terrible experience of losing a 3-year-old. So can you imagine even worse, looking in the eyes of these boys, knowing that, you know, these parents are going to get a message that their son has perished on his orders. And I have to say, it gives me the chills just to think about it. The fully compartmentalized me is looking at this as a professional and thinking, this is one of the most extraordinary acts of moral courage, I think, we had during that war.
Yeah. So courage of a different sort, I think, is called for when Eisenhower decides how to respond to the Supreme Court decision in the landmark 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Can you talk us through that? You know, how does he respond? What does he say in response, or what does he not say? And then how does he deal with the aftermath of this?
Well, first of all, one surprise for me, I'll tell you, Bill, was reading his first State of the Union address, where he actually outlines his strategy for civil rights in America. So I think that should be the end of whether Ike was in favor of civil rights or not. I never understood the idea that he wasn't, because it wasn't the way I saw him behave around people, you know, minorities and people of different religious groups. In any case, he thought this was a matter of American justice. And I think his greatest legacy in this area is probably his court appointments, including those he appointed to the Supreme Court. In today's context, if you'll forgive me a little sidebar here, he thought that the Supreme Court should be ideologically balanced. And when he came to the presidency, you know, the court was weighed in the other direction. So he obviously appointed 5 judges by the time to the Supreme Court by the time it was over. Earl Warren was his selection as Chief Justice. He, according to Herb Brownell, was fully cognizant of Earl Warren's views and supported Brown. And as a matter of fact, I just have a piece with Ed Grosvenor in American Heritage today about the edits that Eisenhower made to the amicus brief for Brown versus Board of Education. He was fully committed to this. But again, he thought the best way to gain the cooperation of the Democrats who were soon to control Congress, many of whom were segregationists, is not to call out people personally and to insult them publicly, but to work with them, because he needed their votes to get the 1957 Civil Rights Act through Congress, which was the first piece of legislation passed on civil rights since Reconstruction. He had an array of other things, but one final thing on this is that he understood what he controlled and what he didn't control. Again, that's the way a military man would think about it. And in this case, he controlled everything the federal government had authority over, pretty much. And that's where he concentrated his efforts, to make sure that there was not rollback after he left office.
Well, and one of the things, of course, he did control was the 101st Airborne.
I know. You know, what I love about this is people say to me, is Eisenhower serious about civil rights? I said, what? He sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. This is the same division that were the paratroopers he visited before they went to Normandy and secured a victory on D-Day. Yes, he was serious. Oh, and if you look at that speech, his jaw is so tight. He is so angry at Governor Faubus for refusing to implement the Brown decision. I think I discovered, I hadn't seen it before, a really moving letter between himself and the parents of the Little Rock Nine about what they'd been put through. But it's also a chapter that has resonance today. I think if he were still alive, he wouldn't believe that we're still so far from resolving this issue in our society.
in some respects, Eisenhower thought of himself, or hoped that he could be, above the pettiness of partisan politics. Say a little bit about how he imagined that he might even start up this new movement or a new party of the center. And what came of that?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. You know, since my book came out, you're the first person to actually mention that in his secret diary, he was actually thinking, this is after he's president of the United States, he was even thinking of starting a third party. He was so aggravated with members of his own party, in large measure, because they had been out of power themselves for so long. They'd lost all skills about how to cooperate, you know, with the White House. And, you know, they opposed so much of what he did in the first term. It was kind of, well, that was a surprise for me. But no, this idea of a third party underscored a belief he had and what he called his two-term administration, the middle way. He believed that there would be a danger to our society, as mentioned before, but if the extremists on both sides dominated the public square, and he wanted very much for there to be this wide road where Democrats and Republicans could compose their differences and make winners out of everybody, so that at least we would be moving forward incrementally to betterment and improvement in our society. Now, some of that was a little naive, of course, because, again, he was rather nonpartisan, really. But I do think that this idea of a middle way lasted a long time. We had some moderate presidents after Eisenhower. And, of course, it seems almost like science fiction today. But he felt very strongly that that was the only way the country would move forward. And then I guess the reason that was so important to him is because the overarching goal was to bring, again, unity of purpose to the United States, and felt the deep divisions were, as he said, a welcome sight to an alert enemy, which also has a fair amount of resonance today after we find out that we already have sovereign governments trying to interfere in our election.
When Dwight Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, he was at that point the most recent in a line of victorious American generals who were elevated to the presidency. And it starts with Washington and Jackson and Grant. Now, it turns out that Ike was also the last in that line. And I want to ask you, having been elevated to the presidency without having to build a base, a track record in politics, did that allow Eisenhower to do things that someone who had come up the normal ladder, Lyndon Johnson, with whom Eisenhower worked, Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, was Eisenhower able to do things, get away with things that someone who otherwise had to be identified with a particular party couldn't?
I think it's a great question. Not only someone identified with a political party, but somebody identified with a region of the country. So Eisenhower had the advantage that actually in his Army career, he had lived all over the United States of America, and he knew these regions very well. As a matter of fact, he lived in Europe twice. He lived in the Panama Canal Zone, and he lived in the Philippines. So that's Europe, Latin America, and Asia. I think his political base could be summed up pretty simply. Those who fought under his command during World War II, or anybody who had, you know, participated in the war in general. They saw him as a victorious figure. I think well-liked from those years. The GIs had a strong bond with him, and they came home, and this accounted for a lot of Democrats who actually crossed party lines to support him in 52 and again in 56. I think it did give him, it gave him an enduring base in a way. And so it's sort of interesting to mark when the controversies happen. The American public, by and large, continues to side with the president, you know, yielding a approval rating in the 60s, mid-60s. After Suez, it was 80%, but, you know, that's fairly remarkable. And now, why hasn't it happened since? I'd ask you, why do you think we haven't had a general now come to the fore?
You have to have a successful and popular war.
Well, great answer. Yeah, I think this has been a big disadvantage. There have been generals in recent times who've been interested, I know, in thinking about it and pursuing it, but it was a huge war, and it took such a large part of the population. Everybody in the United States was doing something for that war effort.
I have to offer just a slight correction to something you said earlier about that Eisenhower wasn't identified with a particular section of the country. Now, I'm sort of an adopted son of Texas, and I can tell you that Texans claimed Eisenhower because it gave them the trifecta during the 1950s of having a Texan in the White House. Ike was born in Denison, Texas.
Right.
He moved to Abilene. But so he was the president, Lyndon Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, and Sam Rayburn was Speaker of the House. And in fact, Texans were so pleased with that arrangement that normally during this period, Democratic Texas went twice for Eisenhower in 52 and 56.
I love that correction. Not only is it a great, well, I have to tell you, I always remark on the fact that Eisenhower was born in Texas. I know everybody thinks that Abilene, Kansas was the host of Eisenhower's origins, but no, imagine. And then, so I go into this in the book, so I won't spend too much time on it, but had this sort of methodology for how to build relationships. And everything revolves around once a week. He chairs the National Security Council once a week. He has a cabinet meeting once a week. He has a press conference once a week. And once a week, he drinks scotch with Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. And this kind of repetitive relationship building really, I think, played an enormous role in what can be seen as almost a successful partnership.
Very much so. And I think that possibility has been lost in Washington because, as you very aptly pointed out, in the 1950s and 1960s, really through the end of the 1960s, there were conservatives in the Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn were pretty conservative. There were liberals in the Republican Party, and so they could find common cause over things like, and here we move to questions from the audience. Say a little bit about Ike's vision for the interstate highway system. Where did he get the idea, and what did he hope to accomplish with it? This comes
Well, I'll tell you, he got the idea from two places. Once in his youth in 1919, he was given the opportunity to take a truck convoy across the United States of America. You'll be amused by this, folks. Started at the Ellipse in Washington and ended in San Francisco. And it took 62 days. 88 bridges collapsed. I don't know how many times the trucks got stuck in the mud. And 62 days, I think he always kept at the back of his mind that something that, this isn't going to work for an emerging power. Then during World War II, it was very obvious for all to see the enormous asset the Autobahn was for the German military. And so in 1956, he said in his diaries that he felt very, very strongly about the importance of an interstate highway system, probably for both of those reasons. But it was part of modernizing this country, and a lot of that modernization, certainly industrial modernization and systemic modernization, all that went on in the 1950s.
Jay has another question about one of Ike's hobbies, bridge. And I'm going to ask you about another of Ike's hobbies, painting.
Right.
So how did this man who had borne the weight of responsibility for so many years, how did he set that aside? How did he unwind? How did he get away from it?
Well, first of all, viewers may be interested to know that he had a little habit, because he could have an explosive temper, but he spent his whole life working on that. So sometimes when he got really aggravated, he'd write in a secret diary. Sometimes when he got aggravated, he'd write the person's name down on a piece of paper, crumple it up, throw it in the bottom drawer, and poor Ann Whitman, his secretary, would have to clear that out every evening. But he also played golf because he had a lot of physical energy. But the painting, I think, was something special. He was extremely interested in noting that other people painted in their spare time, Winston Churchill being a great example of that. And he decided to take it up and see if it would relax him. And it certainly did. As a matter of fact, I would go as far as to say that it was a grounding for him. because it's like any other activity. Some people use gardening, other things. It gets your mind thinking, concentrating on something else. And so I think it's, the only thing I have to add here is that I never thought his paintings, you know, deserved any attention. And he used to throw them out on a regular basis. And his wonderful helper there, Sergeant John Money, would always squirrel them away. So when Ike died, all of these paintings came out of the cupboard, and as a family, we were able to collect some of them. But there's a great scene in the book where a journalist is walking through an exhibition of Eisenhower's paintings, and he says, "General, what is the significance? What is the deeper meaning in this painting?" And Ike turns to him and he says, "Listen, Cohen," he says, "if I hadn't been president of the United States, nobody put this stuff up on the walls." He had no illusions about it, but it did calm him down. It did help him center his own thinking. And I think that's all he ever intended them to be. But we're still happy to have copies of them in our homes, right?
There was something that you mentioned just, I think, in passing in the book, that Eisenhower at the end of World War II decided to quit smoking and just said, "No more, quit cold turkey." Do you think that's characteristic of Eisenhower's self-discipline, I guess?
Yeah, I do. Well, he tried everything first. He tried smoking fewer cigarettes. Then he tried leaving cigarettes all around the house to prove to himself that he was better than those things. And then, as he later confessed, he said, "I just decided to give myself an order." And that worked. So, yeah, I think he was very self-disciplined. And in some ways, he relied on what you might call a privacy of heart and mind. He used that expression in one of his letters. But, you know, sometimes people remark on the fact that during the war, he was smoking, you know, 3.5 to 4 packs a day. And my attitude to that is, please, General Eisenhower, don't stop smoking now, right? You start smoking when the emergency's over, okay?
There's a charming scene you include in the book, this on the topic of giving orders, where Ike is sick, and it looks like he's nearing death. And members of the family have gathered round, and his doctor, I guess from Walter Reed, an Army doctor, says, "Oh, well, he needs his rest. It's time for you to leave." And Ike says, "How many stars do you have?" And he answers, "Well, I've got 5, and they're staying."
Yeah, I remember that. I mean, he sort of roared this from his deathbed. He was, you know, yeah, and you know, that same guy, so it was sort of uncharacteristic of him, which is why it always stayed with me, because he used that huge, wonderful smile of his and was so good to everybody on his staff. But I'll tell you, when the end came, he was going to do it his way, and he was the one who told the doctors, "Now let me go." He says, "I'm ready to go. God take me."
Christopher Purcell asked you to talk about Eisenhower's relationship with General Montgomery during World War II. Monty.
Well, you know, that would be another wonderful one-on-one book, because actually Monty had very sweet things to say about Ike, but I think you'd call it kind of damning with faint praise, because he'd say, "Oh, what wonderful human qualities General Eisenhower had, but it's too bad he isn't a strategist, and it's too bad this and too bad that." Actually, I think the truth is that they were very different personalities, and I think that has to be noted. Also, Montgomery was an icon to the British, and Eisenhower understood the importance of that for British morale, to have an icon like that on his team. And of course, Montgomery was supported by the British for precisely that reason. I think that they had big differences, but I think their post-war years are very interesting to observe. Monty came to the United States, I don't know how many times, and was always feted at the White House by Ike and Mamie. As a matter of fact, I think in the first term, Monty came to, get this, Augusta National Golf Course with Ike and spent Thanksgiving. Was I shocked to have discovered that in my research, because I thought, wow, Thanksgiving is is an intimate affair. But Monty was around a lot. He stayed in a guest house on the farm. And just for anybody who's interested in this relationship, it didn't matter whether Ike got along with Monty. They had another big dust up in the late 50s over Monty's memoirs. that were a little ungracious to Ike, and this was at a time when British-American relations were a little shaky. But Mamie thought he was adorable, thought Monty was adorable. And he once said to her when he came to the White House, he looked around and he says, well, it's not exactly Buckingham Palace. To which Mamie replied with, and she could charm the legs off of a donkey, I can tell you. She looked at him, bat her big, beautiful blue eyes and said, well, thank goodness for that. Well, so that these, so these two had this little repartee going, and Ike just decided that life is too short, you know, to keep up grudges, and they both passed away as friends again.
Gary asks, and this is a question I'm sure that many of the viewers have, many people would have, what would Eisenhower think about the modern Republican Party?
Well, first of all, I can tell you that one of the most interesting things about Eisenhower's leadership is it really, I mean, during the presidency, is it really is a middle way. And his branch of the party, I don't know whether it's fully extinct, but many Republicans who might be called Eisenhower Republicans have now become registered independents. So what he stood for was fiscal conservatism. He was a budget hawk. But he was a social progressive, and that animal, I just don't think there are too many of that breed around anymore in a classical party politics kind of way. I think he would not, he would be absolutely beside himself about the way public officials talk to each other these days. I mean, it does nothing to bring about unity in this country, and as we're seeing, you know, foreign powers have an opportunity to drive a wedge between neighbors and communities, and they can do it because we gave them the roadmap. So he would not approve of that either. And as far as the Republican Party itself, I think he would be surprised at the you know, the spending that has gone on for a very long time. He balanced the budget 3 times during his administration, came close another 2 times, and left his successor with a surplus. So this is a guy who meant business about the economy, largely because he saw it as one of the pillars of our national security, the state of our economy. Yeah.
How about Eisenhower's view on contemporary foreign policy? One of the reasons, at least one of the reasons that Eisenhower claimed that he went into politics was that he was afraid that Robert Taft would weaken America's attachment to NATO. And this is a time when Eisenhower was the supreme commander of NATO. So how would Eisenhower look at today's foreign policy?
You know, no country can dominate the world, even if they want to dominate the world benignly. We have to have friends and alliances around the world. I once wrote a book on the building of the International Space Station. Nobody could afford to do that project all by itself, so it required an alliance of countries that were willing to build the station. I mean, that's a minor example of what goes on in the national security arena. So I think, I'll say one thing, Bill, I do think that it's the one thing he doesn't get enough credit for was turning the Republican Party around in those 8 years from being basically an isolationist party to becoming a party that backed America's place in the world, and in doing so created the opportunity for a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. What we've got today is dangerous, again, because these are the kinds of divisions that actually directly, not just indirectly, affect our national security. I hope no matter who wins the election, that there will be a rethinking of our relationships with countries abroad, and certainly look to our friends again for the kind of solid coalition that we enjoyed for so many years.
So needless to say, whoever wins the election this November is not going to be a World War II hero. You know, we're beyond that. So what lessons from Eisenhower's presidency that are translatable to someone who's not a hero, a general, could you adduce? Say 2 or 3 principles that you draw, because you talk about Ike's principles of leadership. What should any president who gets inaugurated in January of 2021 keep in mind? What can that president learn from Eisenhower's presidency?
Well, I think first of all, that we can do this. It was not an easy time when I came to the presidency in 1953, as you well know. We can do this, so it's really up to us. If you start on that, what I think is an optimistic note, then I think step one would be to find the areas of common ground. We all have so much common ground in this country, and obviously that's not what sells, but that's what works. So I think this is what he did during the war. There are multiple examples of this in the book about his presidency. Again, finding that common ground begins to make it possible to move forward. And then finally, I would say that we have to redefine what leadership means. Today, all we do is talk about winners and losers. Well, this is crazy. You know, compromise used to be the hallmark of leadership because it requires courage to see things from another person's perspective and then to move that along this middle way. And so I think we have to completely abandon this. I've drawn a line on every political issue, and if I compromise, I'm weak. No, no. Strength is about compromising. Digging your heels in is about weakness. And I feel pretty strongly that Ike would have said that, except he would have said it way better than I did, because he actually, he could actually string a few words together in his time.
Well, thank you, Susan. I certainly hope that your book gets in the hands of our next president, whoever that person might be. I'd like to thank you for spending the time with us. I'd like to thank the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, especially to Jamie Kabler, and to everybody who tuned in today. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Take care.